What was the farce jet operation? And what are its implications for U.S. imperialism over Brazil? The farce jet operation was an intervention operation by North American imperialism through disguised forms maintaining the country's shady independence theater, which does not benefit the interests of the same country, precisely because it is a lie, using a populist rhetoric of it fights corruption, but hiding behind its intention to overthrow the national capital that had been growing and becoming a competitor of the American colonizers, as it happened in the time of Getulio Vargas. João Goulart, perhaps in the Tancredo Neves government that did not even reach a current in the Collor government, when he tried to declare a debt moratorium. It is worth remembering the oil discovered in the pre-salt that would leverage the country economically and be invested in education, which would consolidate the country as a power in the future. In addition to bringing down national capital, the other objective was to prevent the country's rebirth as a world economic and political power with the help of the monopoly of the coup press, where the main television and radio networks, with the leadership of the main subservient and actress in this process Globo organizations. This press carried out an intense propaganda campaign in favor of this supposed fight against corruption and against the main nationalist resistance of the Workers' Party, which, despite being corrupt like all other parties, became the Jews of Nazi Germany, the scapegoats, the evil of humanity, emotionally leading people to adhere to this narrative, obviously favored by reigning ignorance and stupid arrogance of people who want to opine about everything and be owners of the truth without realizing that they are mere cattle of the system, and of that years of study and intellectual honesty are needed to express an opinion on complex topics such as politics, history, philosophy, geopolitics, sociology, and the PT was the most electorally viable alternative to an economic nationalism that would lead the country to develop even more for the pre-salt money, even though they were stolen by the illusory debt with the international financial system and the payment of interest on this illusory debt. What did not please the gentlemen and policemen of the world, the USA, then trained federal policemen and Brazilian judges to do the dirty job, as was exposed in the prize that the conductor of this farce won, the Minister of Justice award given by the Bozonaro government to Mr. Sérgio Morossolini, a fascinated and dangerous fascist, a harsh homeland and a traitor to the people. Some of these law enforcement officers and members of the judiciary really believed in that, others are really bullshit. The crisis worsened in President Dilma's second term, even though she was still much smaller than she is now in the bottomless pit of Bozonaro mismanagement. The crisis occurred partly due to a wrong economic policy and Dilma's lack of political articulation. But on the other hand, Parliament stopped the country by not voting any more measures necessary for the country's functioning for 2 years for sheer nonsense and coup, making the country bleed, using terms of the coup senators of the time in recording broadcast on the TV network, and in this medium rotten from corrupt politicians and scoundrels, was now the new enemy and of the same kind as his former comrades, the clown Bozonaro. Who paid the bill was the people. As always, and the illusory scapegoat was precisely the party that did the most for the most humble, when in 2016 there was a coup d'etat, and the president was illegally removed from office due to lack of political climate, though which is repeated now with the clown Bozonaro. But this time the clown has the support of an important part of the military, which puts into play the last good thing that still existed, individual freedoms and democracy, which, even with little progression since the coup, exist to a considerable extent. As Sérgio Morossolini himself said, if he took part in the government, his partiality as a judge would be wide open, which was confirmed by accepting the post of Minister of Justice and proceeding with a farce as a minister. Of course, without touching the corrupt friend of that it has too much power to be arrested or even investigated. Bozonaro himself admitted that the post of minister had already been promised before the election, which demonstrates the fraud in challenging Lula's candidacy, main candidate in terms of voting intentions. The judge was unmasked by the great journalist story of the renowned and award-winning journalist worldwide, Mr. Glenn Greenwald, who through the donation of hackers, exposed with evidence that Judge Sérgio Morossolini guided the prosecution and helped with the alleged evidence which is contrary to law, in that he should acquit Lula and remove him from office for being a partial and immoral judge. But in reality nothing has changed in the circus called Brazil. Only Lula was released when he was no longer a threat to anything, to give an appearance of democracy to the blow. The judge himself did not deny any of the information, because he was above good and evil, and is a friend of Aécio Neves, the current federal deputy who had much evidence and evidence to be arrested for corruption but is loose in the good. Aécio, no one calls for him to be arrested, so one realizes that it is all a poorly done hoax, where some have already begun to wake up and others will die believing or pretending to believe in jet farce, claiming even for colonial authoritarianism and for genocide and torture of innocents, just for having brains and saying no to a dictatorship, not being cowardly and speechless slaves without vision. Soon, the farce jet operation reached its goal of destroying national capital and removing economic and political nationalism from power, but it proved to be overdue, leading to all or nothing of the military coup and the authoritarian bloody state, where there is a logic, and only gratuitous hatred and violence against the people themselves and against the most basic human rights in the middle of the information and internet age. This military coup must be prevented by an impeachment of this clown who has already committed 14 crimes of responsibility, and the main one, calling for the end of the democratic rule of law that allowed him to be president, against democratic institutions, against human rights and individual freedoms, showing that it was always the same human garbage it was before. He just waited for the moment to show himself bloodthirsty and authoritarian, torturer and submissive to imperialism, things that he always was.